Hi, I'm Mike and this is video number 7 where I'm building an event management software from scratch. I'll implement basic file download functionality by adding a few tables to the database. I'll then add endpoints to the API and flesh them out before adding a component with Axios call to the front end. I'll then publish the project on GitHub as version 1. Let's get started. I'm in my SQL workbench here and I'm creating a new table called files. I'll capture the account and event ID the file belongs to, the file name and extension, the size and a few other properties. I will not store the file in the database itself. That would cause it to balloon into gigabytes of data very quickly. I forgot to change the data type of the deleted and created fields here. I'll correct that later. I'm quickly adding indexes and certain fields before adding a second table called downloads. It will keep track of who downloaded a file and when. It will later also serve as tool to show how many downloads each file received. Next, I add the file entity to the API project that will mirror our database table fields. I do this by copying the device entity and modifying it. Then I do the same for the download entity before adding both to the data context for the read and write context. And with that, the two tables are fully integrated into our API and ready to be used. Here I'm refining the files table in the database a little, adding fields for admin, user and visitor access. In turn, I'll also need to add the values to the entity. I'm creating a new controller that will handle files. The first endpoint I'm creating is the upload endpoint. It will be post and I'm decorating it with the authorize tag. It will remain a placeholder for now. I'm also injecting the configuration as well as the read, write and socket context into this controller. I will definitely need all of those later. Next are the download endpoints. They will be of type GET and will either list all the downloads available or just the ones that I have access for the specific account or event ID, or it will download a specific file. I must have been really tired here. It's painful watching the footage while editing and seeing how I stumble along. My brain was running on 10%. I'm also creating a public download endpoint that is not decorated with the authorize tag. The reasoning here is that I created a visitor access flag in the database. That would indicate that I would let unauthenticated visitors download files from the system. This might change though. I have not fully thought this through yet. I'll probably handle the authorization checks in one of the next videos. It will become an important part of the system. With that, I have 4 mainly empty endpoints that I'll need to fill with code. I'm limiting the upload to 200 megabytes. That is subject to change later on. Copilot is helping me out here with a link statement, where I get the information from the file table, making sure it is public for visitors enabled and not deleted. Otherwise I return a bad request. Next I'm adding a path to the app settings where my files are going to be stored. It will be on the local file system of the server for now. In later videos I'll add functionality for Amazon S3, Azure Blob or even Dropbox. Back in the file controller, I first checked that the file actually exists in the file system. For that I use the file info class and combine the path from the app settings with the file ID and extension from the database. It is crude but should work for now. Again, if the file does not exist, I throw a bad request error. I could consider filling a byte array with the content of the file itself, but decide to directly return an octet stream of the file to the client. Later, when implementing other storage options, I'll have to intercept and modify this pipeline. And with that, the public download endpoint is done. Now I'm entering some data to the database for testing purposes, and I'm also adding some files to the file system of the server. Note that I'm using the API branch of the file system. I will have to change that in the app settings. The compiler throws some errors that I quickly fix, like some entity properties I forgot to take out while copying, or the type of some fields in the files table. I publish the API project and enter the number 1 as file ID in the public download endpoint, and the system downloads a corresponding file from the file system. This works great, but a numbered order is easy to guess and not a good idea, so I add a GeoID field to the table that I'll be using instead. Back in the file controller, I replace the ID of type int with the GeoID of type string before adding the field to the file entity. Here I'm tackling the upload endpoint. There's a lot that needs to be added here, like authorization and maybe a virus scan, but I'm focusing on the basics here. So I'm creating an entity file with mostly default values for now, and I'm adding it to the database as a new record before taking the iForm file that was submitted and saving it to the file system. In the front end, I'm moving the login and register components from the event side into the public side. There's no need to select a domain while registering for an event. The event registration will look slightly different. I'm also adding the buttons that trigger these components to the header of the public side. I'm adding two components to my public tree named About and Download TSX. I use snippets from my React plugin to quickly create some dummy code and include them as routes in the app TSX file so they are reachable. Here the header gets modified so it includes download and about in the navbar. Some adjustment is needed here to make sure the navbar does not stretch the whole way. In the lib folder I'm adding FileDTO to my types and essentially are preparing for the Axios call that will get a list of all files. In the API backend I'm creating that same FileDTO in my DTO folder that will mimic the type that I've created in the front end. Notice how all fields here are uppercase. They get converted to camel case in the JSON that comes out of the API, so it will exactly match the type I've defined in my React types library. In the files controller, I'm fleshing out the download endpoint that will list the files from the database. I'm making a simple link query here, making sure the files are not marked as deleted. This is one approach. I'm also exploring creating a list of file DTOs instead by creating a link statement that is pulling from several joined tables. I'm starting out with the files, then joining users as well as file downloads before grouping the results. In the select clause, I'm populating all the fields, some of which will receive aggregates. In the end, I'm removing the first link query, as the second approach is more complex but far more integrated. I'm looping through this file DTO one more time to get all the checksums of each file. For this, I'm writing a function in my helper functions class that will look at each file individually and calculate a checksum. Copilot writes almost the entire function for me. I'm just going through here, double checking everything. Back in the file controller, I inject the helper function class so I can use it. Later on, I'll probably modify this endpoint and include the checksum field directly in the select clause of the link statement instead of looping through the list separately. Now that my endpoint is set, I'll focus on the front end where I'll make a call to the API, retrieve the JSON and display the files for download. I make use of useAuth here to identify the user because the endpoint requires authorization. The useState files will hold all the files in an array that come back from the API, and loading will indicate when the loading of the API is done. This use effect will fire when the component loads. I'm creating an async function that checks if the user is logged in before making a call to the API endpoint using Axios private. If the return is 200, I'm filling the useState files with the JSON coming back from the API. I'm also surrounding the whole block with a try-catch and log any errors to the console. There are some errors here. I forgot to import useState into the component. After some changes, the console seems to be logging the output correctly. Next, I'll make several checks to display some messages to the client. The first will prompt the user to log in if he has a default ID of 0. Second is a simple loading message. I'm importing a spinner here from Material UI. Now I'm mapping over this array to display the actual files. I'm having some difficulties here with the brackets. Sometimes starting over helps. I'm including the index here as I will use it as a key in the div. This seems to be working fine. And lastly, I'm adding a message for the possible case that there are no files to display. I've reached a stage where I will make this project available via GitHub under the AGPL 3.0 license. Please find the link in the description. This system is highly versatile and with minimal modifications can be deployed in many different scenarios. In the next video, I'll work on some core components like authorization and a way to store and recall account settings in the database, so they don't have to be added to the app settings file.